have about 40 of them here today. So regardless, I'd be happy if there was just one person. As long as I can be of some help, I'm happy to do it. So I'm going to move ahead here without any further ado, and we're going to talk about conducting workplace investigations in sort of a virtual world or virtual reality. Before we get into the presentation, though, I do want to talk about a few little housekeeping items. I snuck in a little earlier that I happen to be in the Dominican Republic right now. This is where I'm riding out this pandemic with my family. Long story, I won't bore you all with, but the one thing here, and I'm almost afraid to say it, but power and internet can sometimes fluctuate. Last week we had no problems, and I'm pretty confident we won't this week. But if something happens and my internet drops or the power goes, it'll be back very quickly. And please stay tuned because I'll sign right back in. Also, webinar bombing. I've set the security settings on this as part of what we're talking about today, as a matter of fact. But I have set the security settings, so I don't believe we're going to have any concerns about that today. This is one of the reasons why, which leads to the third bullet here, questions. You can ask them anytime, but I'd ask that you use the Q&A. There's a Q&A button that exists on the, I'm just clicking it right now. And you can ask questions in there. And then what I'm going to do, just write down your questions. I won't necessarily repeat your name or who asked the question. I'll just simply, at the end, repeat the question and provide my thoughts on that particular question. So so hopefully we'll get to all your questions, and like I say, I'll stick around as long as needed to get through all the questions. Now, I have to say, any chance I have to put Dr. Evil into a presentation, I'm certainly going to do that. I honestly think that after this pandemic, the working world is going to undergo a lot of continued change. The concept of quote unquote working from home or working remotely is going to be greatly expanded. I think, in fact, I think a lot of organizations are going to realize that perhaps there isn't as great a need for things like offices or office space. And I think you're going to see a lot of organizations cutting back on office space and maybe moving to a more remote way of doing things. And you know, in our case, we work with a lot of different clients from all over the country. And I have to say that a lot of them do have the basic foundations in place for these types of arrangements. But really, none of them have had to put them to the test like they do now. So organizations have done a lot of scrambling to try and, you know, get themselves in a place where the working remotely idea functions well for them, for their clients, for their teams. Now, when we talk about you know, virtual, I actually called this conducting virtual investigations. And after I created the title, I sort of thought about it and said, well, we're not really doing things virtually, are we? I mean, virtually sort of suggests that it doesn't really exist. It's just something in an apparent or not a real way. You know, I thought about it and thought, well, no, we're doing investigations. We're just using a different method, different approach to getting them done. But it's a new reality, and it's virtual in a sense. The way we might think of things, but really it's more remote. And you know, I recall, you know, we've undergone so many changes over the years. And I recall back in the days when HIV/AIDS was new, and I was a nurse at the time working in an emergency. And you know, all of us were very frightened, very concerned. We didn't know much about that particular disease and what was going to happen to us if we treated people that had it. And, you know, really very much like what's happening now. You know, it was a more gradual thing then. It wasn't a pandemic, obviously, but it really led to a lot of changes. And it led to what we now refer to as universal precautions. It became sort of the other phrase that came out of that, I think, was the new normal, which is a phrase we keep bringing up every time we move on to new or have to experience things. You know, 9/11 created a new normal for travel. And this pandemic is going to create a new normal for work. And for many, many things. And you know, here we are seeing it again. And that, you know, there's a lot of questions, right? I mean, even simple things like, will handshakes really become a thing of the past? Are we going to be walking around with masks on whenever we have a cold? You know, are workers having to practice a whole new form of physical distancing in the workplace? So there's so many ramifications from this pandemic that are going to lead to so many changes and so many things. What I'm talking about today is really just one little corner of that. And And we don't know the answers to a lot of these questions, but in the meantime, we have to keep doing our jobs and keep moving forward. In terms of our altered reality, what is it? What are we going to have to deal with? And I think depending on your industry, whether an essential or non-essential service, we're going to see fluctuations in the number of complaints of harassment and bullying or workplace violence. So the kinds of things we do in terms of workplace investigations, there could be some pretty dramatic changes we see just in terms of the number of complaints. We may see a considerable drop because, well, obviously right now we probably are, because many workers are not at work. And if they're not at work, then there's less opportunity perhaps for some of the issues that we often have to investigate to happen. Some people might feel this isn't the time for that kind of behavior. So even in essential workplaces where people are working, it could be that some people are thinking, no, there's enough going on right now. I don't need to behave like this. And, this is what we would hope for. Maybe I'm a bit optimistic there. And some people might feel that this isn't the time to complain. There's enough going on. I'm not going to start complaining about this stuff, and then, really in some sectors, we might even see a rise. So we don't really know, right? Are we going to see a drop in this type of work or a rise in this work? Some of the factors that could influence a rise might be things like a greater frustration in life. I mean, people, are edgy right now. There's less tolerance. There's a lot of frustration out there. And while, we see these glimmers of kindness, and, they're very heartwarming to see, there's a lot of people out there that are just developing a lot of resentment, a lot of anger. And we're starting to see a lot of that around the United States right now. So what we might see is more violent behavior or inappropriate behavior perpetrated against employees by the public they serve. Again, less patience, less tolerance. And then on the other side, there might be a lot less tolerance for lack of a better word to put it, stupid behavior. When people behave inappropriately, the tolerance for that just might not be there like it might have been before. So we don't really know. There is going to be a change to the number of complaints, and I think some people are going to see a rise and some are going to see a fall. Also the nature of cases is going to change. Even things like, believe it or not, we're already doing an investigation right now regarding a harassment complaint that came out of a series of online virtual meetings where one person felt that another person in these meetings was behaving inappropriately, making faces and things like that. And so, like I said, there will be people who will still do things or be accused of doing things they shouldn't do. So some of these things are happening on computer screens or through video conferences, teleconferences, maybe email communications. For those of you who've done a lot of workplace investigations, you'll sometimes, if I had a nickel for every time somebody would show me an email and say, can you believe that they wrote that email that way? And it comes across like this horrible email in the perception of the eyes of the person who received it. And as an objective person, I look at it and say, no, it's just a very to the point email. These kinds of things are going to be, there's going to be more email communication, more text communication, and all of this is going to change the nature of some of the concerns that people bring up. And this all has implications on, what we're investigating and the stories we might need to sift through to get to the truth. Sometimes witness information will be harder to get. And in some cases, maybe easier. It really is going to depend on the circumstances. People are going to attempt to use a whole new set of excuses for behavior, a whole new set of explanations or contextual descriptions for, why something happened the way it happened. And this is all going to have to, we're going to have to rejig our thinking around these things to develop the proper mindset and understanding of things. And this may have an impact on outcomes, in terms of how much mitigation will we apply to a person who did something and says, I did it because my stress levels were through the roof because of the pandemic, or because I lost a loved one in the pandemic, or because I've been cooped up and I've not had the opportunity to it's affected my mental health. And so these are all things that we're going to have to be ready for and ready to manage. In some cases too, like for example, that case I mentioned, the meeting was being recorded. So the beautiful part about it was that we were able to get the recording of the meeting and we could see firsthand what actually happened. in the end, it wasn't really as bad as it seemed. And we're actually now looking, believe it or not, at doing an online mediation where we're going to get the parties on screen and do a mediation with them and resolve the matter quickly and expediently for them. So yeah, we're going to see changes in numbers, changes in nature, changes in stories. All of this stuff is going to happen. The other thing is communication is going to change, obviously, and we're going to need to function more remotely, kind of the whole point we're here, I guess. But information gathering is going to change. We're going to be making requests using electronic means in order to get what we want. We're going to be document sharing, and I'm going to talk more about that in a few minutes. When we share documents electronically, it's going to result in us having to have good communication platforms. And, some of you may already have some of those platforms in place, some very sophisticated ones, I imagine. And in some cases, you may need to be out shopping to find what you can to do this. Some of the interviews won't be face-to-face for the time being. We're doing lots of investigations right now where our interviews are being done online through video conferencing. And we're not losing much doing that. In fact, I would argue it may even be the more efficient way to do things. I've had organizations hire me. I'm not too far from Toronto. Hire me, fly me out to Vancouver, or some other, Edmonton or Calgary, and pay to fly me out there to conduct an investigation face to face with people. And I'm looking back on some of those investigations and thinking, gee, could we have done them online? Could we have done them using video conferencing? And I'm beginning to believe that, yes, we can. I mean, there will still be some cases we don't want to do that with. Very, very serious cases, things like serious violence cases, sexual harassment cases. But, a lot of the cases we do, it may just make more sense to do these things remotely. And the good news there is the investigation can be just as good and the cost can be much lower. All of these sorts of needs to deal with doing things remotely creates confidentiality issues too. And we're going to talk more about that in a moment as well. Confidentiality is a big issue. There's concerns about, well, are some platforms actually secure? Could people be listening in? Could recorded information be snagged by some third party that, without us knowing? So there's a lot of things, and we're going to talk a bit about the confidentiality considerations in a moment. Some of the longer term realities, there's a few, I think. Once people are back to work, we may very well, as I said, see an increase in complaints. And this could be due to a number of factors. And I talked a little bit about this earlier: reduced tolerance for improper behavior, increased misperceptions of poor behavior. A lot of people are going to be on edge. I can just imagine, maybe we're introduced back to work slowly, and physical distancing is something that apparently that's the new trigger word now. We're not supposed to say social distancing. We're supposed to say physical distancing, because social distancing, I guess, infers no social interaction at all. And so I guess there's a lot to be said for how we describe things. So physical distancing rules may be in place, and I can totally see complaints being made about people not being respectful of that kind of thing. Some of the built up frustration due to all of what we've been going through is going to result in less patience. Some people might argue that it could go the other way, though. This whole experience could cause people to stop and smell the flowers, so to speak, and realize that life's too fragile, to engage in things like bullying or harassing. But the cynic in me says, nah, that's not going to happen. I'd love to think that people will come out of this different on the other end. And while they will be different, I'm not convinced the majority of people will come out different in that way. But again, maybe I'm just a little cynical given that I do this every day. We might be asked to do more with less. Cost constraints are going to be a big issue for a lot of organizations. A lot of them are bleeding money right now. And for them, that's very real. So this can impact the time allotted to the work. You could say, well, you can do an investigation, but we don't want this thing to cost us more than X amount of money. Outside investigators may have to consider reducing their fees in order to work with different organizations. And organizations might have to think twice about, are we going to allocate this work to somebody in-house, or are we going to have somebody outside do it? So the internal investigator versus external investigator issue is definitely going to be an even greater consideration for organizations as they move through these things. Outcomes and resolutions. I mentioned that briefly earlier. The outcomes for many cases often boil down to funding, mediation, team building, ethics or sensitivity courses. I mean, all these things cost money, and organizations are, as I say, are going to be loath to spend money they don't have to spend. Larger scale projects like big workplace assessments, where where there's a smell of a problem, and the idea is, well, let's bring in an investigator or an assessor to try and figure out what the problem is. This we've done a lot of these over the last couple of years, and they're very helpful. But I think a lot of organizations are going to say to themselves, unless we've identified a really significant risk to the organization, we're not going to put that kind of money into these sorts of projects. We're going to find alternatives. So these are all some of the longer term realities that we're definitely going to have to deal with moving forward. So our altered reality is what? It's generated a few things to consider. I mean, I've just gone over some stuff in a more superficial way, but some of the things we have to think about is, number one, safety. Now, to me, safety is obvious. It's always at the top of the list for an employer. It always should be at the top of the list. The safety of your staff, the safety of the public you serve, all of those things are obviously big considerations. But now safety is going to be looked at a little differently. Now we're going to have more to consider. It isn't just about the safety of one, but possibly the safety of many. So this is the type of thing that we need to take into account. I'm also going to talk about some of the other things, communication, confidentiality, and just touch on this notion of human interaction. I definitely want to share my thoughts on that with you as well. In terms of interviewing, as I mentioned earlier, our communication in a remote context is definitely going to change. If we're doing our interviews through some means other than face-to-face, then we need to consider how we're going to do this. How will we approach it, and what will we do differently? Is the substance of our interview going to change, or how we approach the interview going to change, or is it just doing the same thing on a different platform? So, we at my company, and I'm sure many of you have been doing telephone and video conferencing interviews or meetings for quite some time. And in some cases, that's the norm. In fact, we have one client that operates in a very remote area of Northern Ontario, and the standard for them, we've probably done somewhere between, 12 and 15 investigations for them in the last 2 years. And the standard for them has been to conduct interviews using the telephone. We can't even use a video conferencing because these folks are so remote, they don't even have access to Wi-Fi and computers and things like that. And some people might say, well, why not use video conferencing? And it's just, the other thing we have to think of is it might be, and for organizations, it's a little easier, but for some people, they don't have access to these things. Like right now, I've got an investigation I'm doing for a large federal organization. Everybody's working from home, and I'm trying to interview people. And I started off doing video conferencing interviews with a few of them. And then I had to switch to telephone for a few people because, believe it or not, these folks don't have a computer. They can't do it. So the flexibility is going to need to be there. We're going to have to manage these issues. And if we're going down this remote path, then there's a few things we need to keep in mind. First, the interviewing approach. That is probably going to need to change a wee bit, and I'm going to talk about that. Sharing documents. What are we going to do to share documents? There's plenty of options for that. Again, if people have access to some video conferencing platforms, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And how are you going to confirm statements? Whenever we do an interview, we typically want people to confirm that we got it right. We want them to review their interview notes or the statement that we've written so that they can confirm we got it all and we got it correct. That's going to have to be another thing we're going to need to look at. How do we do that? So I'm going to discuss more about that in a couple of moments. Some of the face-to-face stuff, there are matters where face-to-face is definitely preferred, right? I mean, very serious matters such as, things like sexual harassment, where we want that personal connection that only a face-to-face can really allow for. Those types of matters are going to be a little more difficult to do remotely. And if it's in the very short term and there's a way to separate people, I would argue it may, in some cases, if it's really serious, it may be worthy of just separating people and waiting a little bit. But if that wait's going to be extended, then we are going to have to, find another way. And while face-to-face might be preferred, a video platform may be the only option. It's not impossible to do. It's not a problem, really. It's just not the best option. But we're in a situation where we don't have a lot of choice. The other thing where face-to-face interviews are preferred is document-laden cases where we have a lot of documents and we need to compare them, we need to show them, we need to show things to people and have them comment on different things within documents. Having to do that during an interview and even doing it on a video platform that allows for screen sharing is going to slow the interview down. So that's another thing we need to talk about. So we're going to talk about these things in a moment. First, I think it's a good idea to address some of the issues that can get in the way of remote interviewing and possibly corrupt or negatively affect the integrity of an investigation. So the first really is, what service are we going to use? How are we going to communicate with people? In many cases, it is a simple case. A telephone will do the job just fine. And, I would say for telephone, interviewing and cases to be done on the telephone, this is going to be cases that are less serious, simpler cases. Simple witness interviews where there's low level of controversy, you're maybe just calling to confirm something. Obviously, in cases where it's the only option, like the company I talked about that works in Northern Ontario, and cases where there's no documents to share or review. Those are going to be the best cases for a telephone type of approach. And we do a lot of investigations, both workplace and regulatory, using telephone only. And it works just fine if you choose the case right. In terms of video conferencing, I think particularly the ones where we do have the limitations of the telephone, it really is important to find a good video conferencing service, and you have to familiarize yourself with this technology. Know what it can do and what it can't. To give you an example, FaceTime. When the pandemic first started, I'm not even sure it was called a pandemic at that point, but I happened to be in the Dominican Republic, living down here for a month, and I made a conscious decision I was going to do some remote work. It was actually, ironically, I was using it as an experiment to see how the remote work would function for me, and then suddenly found myself having to do it. But one of the things I did was I bought a cheap little $10 tripod that I could put my cell phone in. I turned on FaceTime, connected with the person on FaceTime, had my computer right beside the phone, and could take my notes on the computer and connect with that person through FaceTime. And some people think FaceTime's not that secure, but in fact, FaceTime actually has end-to-end encryption, and it is quite secure. You can't document share, but in the case I used it, it worked just fine. I didn't have to share documents, and it was, and for a lot of workplace investigations, it's not a lot of document sharing anyway. There are some, but for most workplace investigations, it's more about interviewing than it is about reviewing documents, or at least in such a way that the documents could be shared by email and comments could be provided. There's lots of ways around all of those things. The other thing you want to do once you've chosen your platform is understand its limitations and understand its security. For example, we've heard recently in the news problems that Zoom has had with issues of security. A lot of those things were overblown in terms of what was happening, and there was a lot of user error, a lot of security. There were problems, don't get me wrong, but there were security features that weren't being chosen. There was a lot of people sharing invitations to get into the system in the first place. It wasn't so much hacking as we tend to use that word for everything we don't like, or maybe everything we do like, but we tend to use that word hacking a little too freely, I think. It was more user error that led to a lot of the problems with Zoom. That being said, you still want to understand what those security limitations are. You definitely want to practice using your platform. Spend a lot of time playing with it, having dummy meetings with friends or whatever, things that you can do to figure out all the features of how the programs work. There's a lot of them out there. Zoom is only one. There's Microsoft Teams, GoToMeeting, Blue Jeans, Signal. The list just goes on and on. And I think you have to, as an organization, figure out, which one is going to work for you. Because, one of the things is your confidence. your confidence in using the platform and offering assistance to the person you're interviewing is really necessary. And it goes a long way in keeping your interviewee comfortable. So you want to be very competent and comfortable with the platform so you can help the person you're interviewing if they run into difficulties. The other thing too is that prior to the interview, you should have a telephone conversation with the person you're going to interview and let them know, this is what we're going to do. We're going to use this platform. I'm going to send you an invitation by email. You're going to click on it. Be able to provide that information. The other thing is build in some extra time, not only at the beginning. I say here at the beginning for setup and managing problems, but again, what I've been finding is that my interviews are 10 or maybe even 15% longer when I'm doing them by video conference. And I think that really just has to do with the process of building rapport. People are sort of fascinated by the technology. It leads to some friendly conversation, which is all part of being a good interviewer and putting your interviewee at ease. So there's nothing wrong with that as long as it's appropriate conversation. But I would build a little extra time in when you're using video conferencing for your meetings or your interviews. Also, make sure you do have telephone as a backup. Make sure you have a number for the person so you can reach them if necessary. Now, recording the interview, you might wish to record it, and we generally recommend this. We recommend recording interviews all the time. I mean, recording is really the gold standard for ensuring that you have an accurate record of the interview. Now, there's lots of ways to do it. It's interesting. A lot of our workplace clients and some of the workplace lawyers that we work with are not big fans of recording the interview. Sometimes we have to take that direction, and we do. And so what we do is we write out or type out statements, and then we actually have an electronic signature pad that we use, and we have the person review the statement right there. And then we connect the signature pad, have them sign the statement, save it as an uneditable document, and it works out beautifully. But recording is amazing if you can do it. I still think you take notes while you're recording, but video conferencing platforms usually just have a one button record, and you've got the whole thing laid out, and that really can be helpful for you later. Start the interview by explaining that you want to record it. Don't have the system on record when you start the connection with the person, but simply explain to the person that you want to record the interview, get their consent. And once you have their consent, you can start the recording and then go through the process of catching on the record the fact that you've asked for it to be recorded, mention the date, the time, your name, the name of the person being interviewed, and that it is being recorded, and ask them to confirm for the record that they're comfortable with the recording. In my experience, most people are fine with it. There will be the odd person who's not comfortable with it, and that's fine. If they are, you find another way. And that might mean having to just take your notes and maybe share your notes with them. If you've got screen sharing, they can, this is what we do because we don't like to have our statements out there while the investigation is happening. So one of the things that we'll do is we will use the screen share if we're doing a video conference, let them read the notes right there and just capture their verbal agreement to that. Sometimes they'll allow us to just record that part, just to say, look, I just need some record that you're in agreement with these notes. I want to turn on the recording for that purpose and that purpose only. They can see when it's recording and when it isn't. So you can explain that as well. And this is where it goes back to my point earlier about really having a good handle on the technology. You don't want to be fumbling around while you're trying to do these things. That makes people uncomfortable. Some of you who might be worrying or wondering about technical concerns around confidentiality, don't fear that's coming. I'm going to be talking about that in just a moment. In terms of interview considerations, in my opinion, the interview is no different than any other interview. The fact that you're not face-to-face doesn't really change the essentials of the interviewing process. Stick to what you know, stick to what you do best. The less that you alter, the less you're going to need to adapt. So, there's no need to be doing things dramatically different in these interviews. I do think it's important to think about a few things. Think about your appearance and your video background. I've had some meetings with people where I was just talking yesterday to somebody who they didn't realize it, but their teenage son slipped in behind them while I was talking to them and started dancing around with his middle finger up on both hands, showing me the middle finger, giving me a little dance. I had to sort of say to the person I was interviewing, you got a little joker behind you there you might want to deal with. And of course, then I had to sit through about 1 minute of yelling while the mother put her son in his place. So, I'm sure none of us would do that. Certainly none of us would intend to do that, but it is important to be somewhat aware of our backgrounds. In fact, some of these systems can actually create an artificial background behind you. And I had one of the investigators on my team joined a team meeting that we had on Zoom, and it was like she was sitting in the Simpsons living room from the cartoon The Simpsons. It was actually really funny. So yeah, there's a lot you can do. Also, your appearance. When we're working from home, when we're doing things on video conference, when we can't get to the hair salon, to get our hair cut or other things. I've had several people complain to me about how shaggy their hair looks and how embarrassed they are to do a video conference because their face is front and center. But besides that, it's still important to appear professional. And, if we're in a tank top while we're talking to somebody on video conferencing, that's just not professional. And so we have to be cognizant of the fact that we want to maintain that professional appearance. Obviously you want to build rapport with the interviewee, and that's maybe even more important than it is in face-to-face interviews, because it is uncomfortable for people. So build rapport like you normally would, maybe even put a little extra effort into that. And you can do that through sharing or explaining the process, giving them an opportunity to ask you questions so they feel more connected to it all and feel like they're not being sort of spoken to or whatever, but rather they're a part of this. Reassure them. Giving them the opportunity to ask questions can really help put them at ease. Also, spend some time assuring the people that you're interviewing that you're in a private place. That if you're using earbuds or something like that, so that they know other people aren't hearing what they're saying, and ask them to confirm the same. I'm going to talk a little more about that when we get to confidentiality. So some of the other interviewing considerations, it's okay to allow for breaks. Again, if it's a long interview, if you're going through a lot of information, people still need breaks like they do any other time. So you may need to put things on hold while you go through that process. And try to use the camera well. Occasionally look at it. Again, we sometimes kind of forget that we can be seen. We may forget about the camera. And have our heads down typing the whole time, scratching our ear or whatever. These are all things that, remember there's a camera on you. Occasionally look at it to make that connection with the person you're talking to. And when you're asking questions and when you're answering questions, try to look into the camera. A lot of us tend to look down. We look at our keyboard while we're talking, and we're not looking into the camera. We're all guilty of that, and it's something that we can do that will really help us. The surroundings around you, I talked a little bit about that, but also try to be careful not to have too many distractions that could cause you to be looking around. It's interesting because when you're on camera and you're doing one of these things, your face is sort of filling almost the whole screen that the person's looking at. And just a little glance to the right, to the left, up or down is easily noticed and seen. And you can end up appearing like you're distracted or not paying attention, you're disinterested. So, try to remember that you're really trying to engage with that person. When you're face to face, it's a little different. Something you happen to look over to the right while you're talking to the person, you're in the same room. It's just a different dynamic. When you're on camera, these things are accentuated. So it's good to be aware of that. You want to try to create that confidence for the person. You certainly don't want to be doing this stuff. When you're try to avoid those apps. And one of the things I did even doing this webinar was I spent a lot of time making sure I had certain applications closed. My email was off, so you wouldn't be hearing beeps and tones and rings and other things. I mean, of course, none of us are going to do what this woman's doing, but again, it's good to be aware of these things. It's as far as this type of thing is concerned, obviously we're not going to be doing that, but something to think about anyway. So assessing credibility, this is one of the things that people will say, well, it's very difficult to assess credibility when you're not face-to-face with people. I actually disagree with that. Now, on a telephone call in particular, we do lose a huge chunk of nonverbal communication, body language, all of those things. We lose a lot of that stuff, and that does take away a chunk of the communication. They say that 85% of communication is nonverbal. Only 15% is the verbal piece and what's said. The rest is tone of voice, volume of voice, body language, mannerisms, facial expressions. And so on a telephone, you definitely lose all of that. But I say don't worry so much about the nonverbal. Making judgments on people's credibility is tough enough face to face. And any of you that have heard me speak on this know that I'm not a huge fan of drawing a whole lot of inference from things like facial expressions and body language. Don't get me wrong, it's useful, but much less so on video conference, and pretty much impossible on the telephone. And really, I wouldn't lose a lot of sleep over it. The other thing to remember too is that when people are on the telephone or on a video conference, it can affect their communication style and can lead to unusual tics or mannerisms that they might do that could be misleading to you. And I always tell this story, I've told it so many times, but I always tell the story about the time I was giving a talk in a room of about 40 people. And there was a lady sitting at the back of the room, and she had her arms folded and a sour look on her face, just miserable looking, crossed arms, shrugged shoulders. And the whole time I'm talking, she's like that. I'm looking at her and I'm thinking to myself, I'm building a story in my head about, oh my gosh, that lady doesn't like what I'm saying. Looks pretty angry. Then I get to the Q&A portion and I ask if there's any questions, and and she suddenly throws her hand up, just shoots it up in the air, still with this miserable look on her face. And I'm looking around hoping somebody else in the room has a question, but they don't. And then I call on her, and in the sweetest, quietest voice, she says, "Is it okay if I close this window beside me, because I'm freezing?" And I realized then how I had completely misjudged. I had completely misinterpreted her body language. And that happens all the time. These notions where people don't make eye contact with you, that's a myth to begin with. People crossing their arms, shaking their head, looking up to the left or down to the right, all these kinds of things. There's truth behind all of that stuff, but that's not really where assessing credibility comes from. And you certainly can't put anything like that in a report or hang your hat on that kind of thing. So I say to people, don't worry so much about that. Instead, focus on what's being said. Consider the things like has what the person said to you, is it even plausible? Does it even make sense? Do you have any way of corroborating what they said? Is there documentary evidence or other witnesses who might corroborate what that person has said? Consider some of the behaviors during an interview. Is the person defensive? Are they angry or being dismissive during the interview? Are they trying to discredit or criticize other people? These are the kinds of things that speak more to credibility than whether a person is, shifting in their seat. And so if you focus on those things, doing things by video conference or even telephone is not that bad. To do this, ask probing questions about specifics. The truth is in the details. Don't gloss over general denials. Don't allow people to provide general statements, but get into the weeds, get into the details of people, because that's where the true credibility assessment can take place. Pay attention to efforts by the interviewees to reframe or change the context of situations. Sometimes people say, well, yeah, that happened, but it was because of this, this, and this. And they change the reason or the context around what happened to try and make it seem like it's less of a problem. And so these are the kinds of behaviors, the kinds of conversations that you're going to have where that's when you start questioning credibility. Establish a motive. Who has a motive to be untruthful, or who has a motive to be truthful? But ask yourself about those things as well. Now, when it comes to interviewing on the telephone, there are some specific things to keep in mind, I think. Interviewing on the telephone is again, it's not hard, but you have to be cognizant of things like tone and pace. The tone and the pace can make or break a telephone interview. So try to avoid matching what you get from the other end of the call. And what I mean by that is that sometimes people on the phone are dismissive. They're in a hurry to end it. Sometimes people on a phone call will be more aggressive than they'll be face-to-face. I'm sure we've all experienced that. It's really easy to yell at somebody over the phone or to send a nasty email, for example, or hide behind your computer. When you get face-to-face, people tend to change their tune a little bit. So, if you reflect back the same behavior you're getting, you're only escalating the situation, not making the situation better. So be aware of that. Use de-escalation techniques to manage behavior and take time on the call to work with the person. Also, you want to think about using some softer language, and what I mean by that is you come across friendlier and more open when you phrase things a different way. Really, just as you can't see the nonverbal behavior of the person you're interviewing, they can't see yours either. So you want them to be relaxed and not on edge, and how you speak makes a difference in how you're perceived. So, you can start asking questions like, would you happen to know? I'm curious about this, as opposed to very direct, specific questions. When you get into very direct questions and you don't, sort of soften them a little bit like that, on the telephone, that can come across as harsh. The other thing too is every once in a while, speak. Sometimes people will provide you with a long narrative, and that's good. That's a good thing if they're sharing information. But every once in a while, throw in the odd I see or or whatever, to let them know you're listening. Let them know that you're paying attention to what they're saying. I know there's times where I've been on calls, especially being down here in the South. Sometimes calls get dropped, and I find I've been talking for 3 minutes, and then my phone rings. I'm like, wait a minute, what's going on? And it's the person calling me back because I got cut off 3 minutes ago, but was yakking away and had no idea. So throwing in the odd thing like I see or whatever can certainly help. Typically, I advocate for using the technique of allowing interviewees to provide long narratives, ask open-ended questions. And I think that still works on the telephone and on video conferencing. But some people might be uncomfortable with that. So be prepared, if you have to ask more probing questions, more direct questions if you have to, just to kind of push people along. Note-taking during interviews, again, I always throw this in. It's not so much specific to virtual or remote investigations, but I think it's important to remember. Explain that you're going to take notes and why. Because if you're on a video conference, they're going to see you doing it. Try to pull your head up from your computer or paper occasionally, and I've already spoken to that. Maybe even use 2 computers or a computer and a cell phone if you're typing your notes. One thing that some people have tried to do, and I've seen them run into problems when they've been talking to me, is they use that split screen where they have the video piece on one half of the screen, and they're only using half the screen for their notes, and it's small. I see them squinting, leaning into the thing to try, and it's just if you have the ability to use 2 computers or 2 screens, that can be helpful. Be objective in your note taking. I always tell the story of, the belligerent person, or the person I would conclude to be belligerent. I'm interviewing them. They suddenly get upset. They call me a few choice words, slam their fist on the table, storm out of the room. My note-taking of that incident has to be objective. And what I mean by that is, if a person says to me, you're a bleep, 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 and I hate you, and I hate this company, and they storm out of the room, and they kick a chair, and they slam the door, I don't want to be saying things like, the interview subject became disrespectful and belligerent and stormed out of the room. That's putting a conclusionary statement on and an interpretation on what they did. Instead, you want to document observations. The person raised the tone of their voice and said, quotes, bleep, bleep, bleep. They got up suddenly, kicked a chair, punched the wall, slammed the door, and left the room. Very objective language to lay out what they did. That's important in any note taking. Also, document your own thoughts separately from any information you're receiving. Their statement is their statement. Keep a separate notepad or a separate piece of paper to jot down anything that you want to write down. It might be something like remembering to circle back and ask another question, or go back to another thing they talked about, or whatever. Use a separate piece of paper for that, and just keep track of that separately. Take notes even if you're audio taping. You never know when the audio tape might fail you. In terms of document sharing during interviews, there's a few things you can do. If you need to compare or reference documents, you really have 2 choices. You can send them in advance through a secure sharing portal or encrypted email service, something like that. You may not want to, send sensitive or confidential documents out there. There's a lot of things you don't necessarily want to have in the hands of the people you're interviewing. So, being able to send these things through is not often a good idea. Doing screen sharing and sharing them during the interview using a screen share feature is really helpful. I mean, I'm basically using a screen share feature now. That's why you're seeing my slides. It really is great because it allows you to easily point out specific parts of the document, get them to comment on those parts. and it's better for keeping control of the documents and protecting confidentiality. I mean, that being said, there's nothing to stop the person from, discreetly pulling out their cell phone or having their cell phone on the side and taking a picture of the screen. But we can only go so far, right? We have to do what we can do. No matter what though, no matter what approach you take, it's going to eat time. So remember to sort of build some of this extra time into your interview, because you're going to need to plan for it. And if screen sharing, make sure you close all the other programs on your computer, because you don't want to be this guy. That's just not where you want to be. So the last thing about document sharing is talking about sharing the actual interview. If you're recording the interview, it may not be necessary to have the person review the statement and sign it because you've recorded it. As long as you pull the accurate information out of that when you write your report, you'll probably be okay. But if you're not doing that, if you're not recording it, then there's a few different options you can turn to. In face-to-face interviews, as I said, we use that electronic signature pad, and it works beautifully. But in your doing these types of investigations, emailing and having an email back, there's programs like DocuSign where you can have a person sign electronically on a document. Again, that sort of puts it in their hands. So you have to decide whether it's okay to have that statement out there. And then the other thing is to screen share and just record the verbal confirmation, which is what we've mostly been doing, and that works quite effectively. So getting back to the technology and confidentiality. So there's a few things as an organization that you want to do. And I did promise I would talk about confidentiality, and there really are a litany of issues that we need to be aware of. The first thing I would say is if your organization is using any kind of technology like cloud-based platforms like SharePoint or even your own customized database or whatever, you should have some sort of two-factor authentication process in place. If, for example, in our company, none of our staff can get into our network without having two-factor authentication. What I mean by that is you have a password that you use to enter it, and then you're going to get a message maybe on your telephone. That's one way it can be done. The other way is some people carry a little fob that has like a digital code on it that changes every so many seconds, and it's going to ask you for that, and you're going to either get that and approve it, and that's the second factor. That's the second approval to get in. The beauty of this is if for some reason somebody gets your password, they still won't be able to get into the system because they're not going to receive that second authentication. You'll see a lot of places, a lot of things are moving to that now. Even a lot of social media sites are offering two-factor authentication for being able to log in to the programs. When you're sharing files, if you have to share files, make sure you're using online portals that are proven safe. Consider maybe an encrypted email service. There's lots of things we can do to mitigate concerns around confidentiality. A lot of it starts with educating yourself and your staff. Little things like, save documents on a secure server only if you're using SharePoint or a secure network of your organization. Leaving documents on your desktop, your laptop, or worse, a USB stick can really make them vulnerable. I mean, yeah, you can have passwords on your laptop and things like that, but there's ways around those things. And the safest thing is when you're working on a document, save that document in the place where it's going to be most secure. That's the point there. Certain things like Hotmail and Yahoo, and I don't mean any offense by this, but Hotmail and Yahoo have been shown to be subject to scanning by some companies for commercial marketing purposes. So while your email is unlikely to be compromised as a result of this, I mean, the flat out truth of it is those emails are getting scanned potentially, and you don't want to use any service that's going to do that. Also, I don't know, there's something about Hotmail and Yahoo that looks a little unprofessional, not to mention makes you look like a bit of a dinosaur. But again, I don't mean any offense. When you're emailing and you're doing emails, I mean, they can go astray. So don't put names in email communications. There's no need for that. If they contain names and there's a breach or the email goes astray, then you've got a problem. If you have to send documents by email, use some kind of password protection. Ideally, PDF the document. If you're going to be sending a document, try to put it in a PDF format and password protect it. password protected PDFs are very difficult to crack. A Word document that's password protected can be broken by a 10-year-old. So don't think that if you password protect a Word document, it's protected, because it really isn't. It's free software you can just grab and use. Phishing emails, those have grown exponentially since the pandemic started, and they were already a big problem in my opinion. So you have to be aware of and careful that these are not, that you're not vulnerable. We remind our staff constantly. We had a breach once where somebody got into one of our staff members' email, then they went in their email, changed the rules so that no emails they got went to their inbox. They all went directly to their deleted folder. And then the person used their entire contact list to send emails out to other people, all in an effort. It was a horrible, horrible experience for us. Thankfully, because of that's what led us to move to two-factor authentication when that happened. If we'd had two-factor authentication at the time, then they wouldn't have even been able to get into the person's email. And we wouldn't have had the problem. So, it's really important to recognize this and educate your staff. These phishing emails are becoming so good, so easy, so easy to fall for. So be cautious about that. Some other practice considerations, make it clear that confidentiality is of prime importance. Ask the interviewee when you're interviewing them to ensure that they're in a private and confidential space. Clear your workspace of people. Like I said, in this pandemic situation where people are all working from home, I can't count how many calls I've had interrupted by children, pets. One person, their cat jumped right on their computer in the middle of the call. So, these are things that, try to encourage people to abide by these things. And the same rules apply to support people and representatives such as union reps or lawyers. They too need to be maintaining appropriate confidentiality. And, that's all we can do to really make sure we're managing that. So private space, earbuds is helpful so people can't overhear, and that goes a long way. And I mentioned that I wanted to talk a little bit about human interaction. And what I mean here, it really is that there is an impersonal nature to remote communications. And I think it's important that we try to be aware of that and find ways to bring the human connection into the process. So, some people would argue that our society's already lost the personal touch of communication with the advent of smartphones, social media, internet. All these things have really made the world a lot more impersonal. And now out of necessity, we're looking at even more ways to avoid face-to-face interaction. So I think it's important that we acknowledge that gap, try to minimize the impersonal nature of communicating remotely by sharing information, explaining why we're doing things the way we're doing them, acknowledge that you're going to do your best to make it a positive experience. I mean, let's face it, when we're doing investigations, nobody's all that positive about it, are they? I mean, they're not happy about being involved in the first place. So we have to do what we can to try and minimize that. That's where the need to establish rapport becomes even more important than ever before. So, and it's okay, share a story. Discuss the current situation, maybe even say how much you're looking forward to something like, watching your favorite sports team play again, or going to a concert, or, whatever it is. I mean, try to make it human, try to make that connection in that way so that people can really feel a little more connected and a little less robotic about the whole thing. So with that said, I'm going to move on now to questions. And I actually have one last slide here. I'll just quickly put up on the screen my contact information. I am going to go to the question and answer piece and see who's asked questions and try to answer them to the best of my ability. Also, as I mentioned, some of you might not have heard this, but I am going to be putting this this whole thing on I almost said Yahoo, on YouTube. The recorded presentation will be uploaded later today. So if you missed something or missed the first part of it, or you have a friend who you think might find it useful, it'll be available for people to be able to see. Now, with that being said, I'm going to go back to starting my video so you can see my smiling face and take a look at any questions that we have. There we go. And in terms of questions, I have one whole question, and that is, will the slides be shared after the webinar? I am happy to share the slides after the webinar. So if that's something that you want, because there's so many people and it's a little difficult to send out so many emails, could you do me a favor and send me an email if you'd like to get the slides? That way, because some of you probably don't want them. They're also going to be on YouTube. The whole thing's on YouTube, so you can see it there. But if you do want the slides, please send me an email and let me know, and I'll be happy to get them to you. We have one question that popped up. Who sees the video? Is it for your use only, or is it shared with others, or only shared if things go to court? If you're recording it, I mean, the way I look at it is it would be for my use only. If it's not going to court, if it's not going to a tribunal, the whole point of recording the session is I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for a moment. There we go. So the whole point of doing it is really just to make sure there's an accurate record. I don't want someone coming back to me later and saying, "Hey, Dean, you know what? I didn't say that," or "You got it wrong," or "You misinterpreted it." And there's no better way to guarantee that I got it right than to say, "Well, I have a recording and I do have it right. It's right here." That doesn't happen very often, but it's nice to know that protection is there, and it's really protection also for the person being interviewed. And that's what if they question it, that's what I often say. It's protection for you as well, because maybe I could get something wrong. I mean, I do my very best not to, but if I do, and there's a dispute, we have the ability to go back and make sure that I got it right. And if I got it wrong, then we can make the appropriate change. However, I mean, if things were to end up going to discipline, or some kind of disciplinary process, which eventually led to maybe an arbitration in a unionized environment or in court or something like that, yeah, I have to hold on to those recordings. And it could be that those recordings would be disclosable. In fact, I'm sure they would be. I'm sure it'd be one of the first things that get asked for as part of the disclosure would be the recordings of the interviews. I mean, when we don't record interviews and we take notes, the first thing that's asked for anytime something goes to any kind of tribunal or proceeding is through the disclosure process, we're asked to provide our interview notes. So I see no reason why we wouldn't also be asked to provide the recordings. So I hope that answers your question. And I know for some people that poses a little concern. If I have to share, if I have to hold on to all these videos, that's going to take up a lot of valuable space on my server, or it's that kind of thing. So so I can see where that could be a bit of a question mark for some people. But again, I think having the accurate record is the best way to go, if at all possible. I don't see any other questions that are coming up here, and that's okay. I'd like to think that's because I've covered things off really thoroughly. So I'm going to just stop the video there and just give you all a break. You don't have to look at my face anymore. But I do want to thank you all. I really do sincerely hope that you found the webinar useful and helpful, as we go through this sort of uncertain time that we're facing. As I mentioned, this is something we're all going to see more of. And even when this crisis ends, we're still going to be doing this, a lot of this type of work. We're really here to help. My contact information was shared with you. It's on that last slide, which again will be on our YouTube channel. I'll send out a link to all of you along with the thank you for attending the webinar. So you'll be able to find that. You'll be able to find the video of this very easily. Other than that, I guess all I can say is thank you. Stay safe, stay healthy. Wishing you all the best. And if we can ever be of help, whether it be to consult on something or to do an investigation or to simply help you in any way we can, we're here, and certainly look forward to hearing from some of you in the future. So at that, I will leave it and thank you all very much, and have a great rest of the day.